second grade. We're back again to read the next chapter of one of our favorites, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. My classroom here is getting much bigger. As you can see, I've got Winston and Milo, but also Callie and Kenzie taking a little break from their remote learning to listen to this chapter today. It is the Thought You Setter's Cure. And I really hope that while you're stuck at home that you are not doing this with your parents. Mr. Burbank absently reached from behind his newspaper for the sugar bowl. His groping fingers hit the toast, the honeycomb, the salt cellar, and finally found the sugar bowl. His children, Darcy, Allison, and Bard, nudged each other and laughed. Every morning, Daddy felt around on the table for the sugar while he read bad news in the newspaper. One morning, the news was so bad and he was so absent-minded he put currant jelly in his coffee. The children were anxious for a repeat performance and hopefully pushed everything but the sugar in the path of his searching hand. This morning, as soon as Mr. Burbank had found the sugar, he let the paper down with a bang. "The sugar bowl's empty," he said in an aggrieved, hurt way. Mrs. Burbank, who was buttering toast, said, "Darcy, run out to the kitchen and fill the sugar bowl, dear. The sugar's in the big red can." Darcy obediently got up, took the sugar bowl, and went out to the kitchen. After a long, long time, he came back to the breakfast table with a plate of cinnamon rolls. "What are these for?" his father said. "And where's the sugar?" "Sugar?" said Darcy. "What about sugar?" "I told you to fill the sugar bowl," said Mrs. Burbank. "Oh," said Darcy. "I thought you said get the cinnamon roll." All three children looked at each other and laughed loudly. Finally, Mr. and Mrs. Burbank laughed too. Darcy went out and filled the sugar bowl, and Mr. Burbank, after 3 cups of coffee, missed the bus and decided to walk as far as the school with the children. Just as they were going out the front door, Allison remembered her arithmetic book and dashed upstairs for it. In a minute, she leaned over the banister and called, "Mother, did you see my arithmetic book?" Mrs. Burbank said, "What does it look like?" Allison said, "It's blue and not very thick." Mrs. Burbank said, "I think it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "How did it get out there?" Mrs. Burbank said, "Out where? I said it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "Oh, I thought you said it's out in the stable in a stall." All three children roared with laughter. Allison found her arithmetic book, and they all left the house laughing and repeating, "Out in the stable in a stall." Here's a picture of the kids at the breakfast table waiting for Mr. Burbank to find the sugar. Mr. Burbank said, come on, we haven't all day." He walked briskly along the street, his footsteps ringing loudly and purposefully in the thin autumn air. The children giggled and jostled along behind him, their progress so uneven and broken by "thought you said" and shrieks of laughter that Mr. Burbank reached the corner first, in fact, almost before they had left the yard. He stopped to wait for them and to survey the city spread out below him in the morning sunshine. He was glad he lived on a hill, he was glad he was alive, and he was glad he had a little boy 9, a little girl 7, and a little boy 6. When the children had caught up with him, he said, "Look, children, see how beautiful the city looks from up here? Watch the fog rise over there." "Where's the dog?" said Bard. "What dog?" asked Darcy. "What color are the dog's eyes?" asked Allison. "What on earth are you talking about?" said Mr. Burbank. "I said, watch the fog rise over there." "Oh," Bard said, "I thought you said watch the dog's eyes glare." All the children laughed and laughed. Mr. Burbank said, "What nonsense." But it was a beautiful morning, so he laughed with his lighthearted children. When they were halfway down the next block, the children suddenly stopped, stock still in front of a pretty white house, and yelled in unison, "Marilyn! Marilyn! Come on, we'll be late." Mr. Burbank said, "That's no way to do. If you want Marilyn, go to the door and ask for her." Sorry, so my dogs heard "come" and they thought that was their cue. All right, Milo, sit down. The children looked surprised, but went obediently up to the door and rang the bell. Marilyn's mother opened the door and said something to the children which seemed to send them into convulsions of mirth. Doubled over with laughter and holding their sides, they came down the walk to their father. Now what's so funny? Mr. Burbank asked. Darcy said, Marilyn's mother said Marilyn fell in the toaster and is burned up dead. Mr. Burbank said, what did Marilyn's mother really say, and why isn't Marilyn going to school? Allison said, she said Marilyn fell in her coaster and hurt her head, and Darcy thought she said Marilyn fell in the toaster and is burned up dead. She went into another paroxysm of laughter. Mr. Burbank didn't laugh. Instead, he bent down and examined Darcy's ears, which were large and pink and soft and quite clean. They should work, said Mr. Burbank, looking at the other children's ears. They all seemed quite normal. The children wanted to know what he was doing. Bard said, what are you doing that for, Dad? Mr. Burbank said, I'm trying to decide whether I should get you an ear trumpet. Beer crumpet? What's that? Bard said. The other children repeated after him, beer crumpet, beer crumpet. They all laughed but Mr. Burbank, who had had enough. He said, come on, I'll supervise a race to school. On your marks, get set, go. When Mr. Burbank reached his office, the very first thing he did was to call Mrs. Burbank. He said, Mary, have our children ever had scarlet fever? She said, now you know they haven't, Bernard. Well, he said, have they ever had any ear infections? Goodness no, said Mrs. Burbank. They've never had anything. They're the healthiest children in the neighborhood. What's the matter? Mr. Burbank said, plenty. They can't any of them hear well. I told them to look at the fog rise, and they thought I was talking about dog's eyes. Marilyn's mother said that Marilyn fell off her coaster and hurt her head, and they thought she said Marilyn fell in the toaster and was burned up dead. Mrs. Burbank finished for him. Bernard, did you ever hear of anyone falling in a toaster? Of course not. There's nothing wrong with our children's ears. It is just that they are going through that awful thought you said phase. Well, let's get them out of it, said Mr. Burbank. They sound like big dopes. Dog's eyes, indeed. Mrs. Burbank said, don't worry, dear. I'll take care of it. As soon as she finished talking to Mr. Burbank, Mrs. Burbank called Marilyn's mother to find out about Marilyn, if she was badly hurt and if there was anything she could do. Marilyn's mother said Marilyn was just fine, but the doctor thought she should be quiet for a day or two. When Mrs. Burbank asked Marilyn's mother if she ever had any trouble with the thought you said, and told about the sugar bowl and the cinnamon rolls, the arithmetic book and the stable and the stall, about Marilyn's fall and the toaster and the dog's eyes, Marilyn's mother said, oh, Mrs. Burbank, I'm so glad you called and told me all this. You see, Marilyn has been doing the same thing all morning, and I was terribly afraid that that blow on her head had affected her mind. When I asked her if she wanted crumpets or toast, she said, bumped on the nose? Who? When I asked her if her head pained her, she said, I thought you said, is the bed painted yet? Mrs. Burbank said, I'm going to call up Mrs. Piggle and see if Terry or Teresa are thought you saids. She is such a good manager that if they have thought you said-itis, she's probably thought of a cure. Marilyn's mother asked Mrs. Burbank to call her back if she got any useful information, and they said goodbye. Then Mrs. Burbank called Mrs. Piggle. She told her all about the thought you said-itis and asked if she had any similar experiences with Terry or Teresa. Mrs. Piggle said, oh, now, Mrs. Burbank, you see, we have always studied correct speech, and we all speak correctly. The children always pronounce all their vowels and all their consonants, and therefore we never have any trouble understanding each other. Perhaps the trouble lies with you and Mr. Burbank. Perhaps you do not speak distinctly. Perhaps the poor little children cannot understand you. I am holding little speech classes every afternoon, and if you and Mr. Burbank are interested, I would be glad to have you attend. I wouldn't care to have the children because I am afraid they might corrupt my children's perfect speech. Mrs. Burbank thanked Mrs. Piggle for her kind offer and told her that perhaps she was right, that she and Mr. Burbank would try to speak more distinctly, and if things didn't improve within the week, they might join the speech classes. Mrs. Piggle said, glad to be of help any time, Mrs. Burbank, and hung up. That night, when Mr. Burbank came home, she told him about calling Mrs. Teagle and told him that she thought that from now on they should both try to speak more carefully so that their poor little children could understand them. That night at dinner, Mr. Burbank announced in a very loud voice, "Please pass the butter." The children all exchanged glances and whispers, then laughed. The butter remained cool and comfortable on its little plate in front of Darcy. Mr. Burbank looked accusingly at Mrs. Burbank. She said in a high, unnatural voice, "Children, listen to me. Please pass your father the butter." "Oh," said Darcy, "did you say pass the butter? I thought you said, please gasp and mutter." Allison said, "I thought you said, he's Pa's mother." Bart said, "I thought you said, freeze Pat's brother." Mr. Burbank said in a low, grim voice, "I said, please pass the butter." Darcy passed it to him with a beaming smile. The next morning after breakfast, Mr. Burbank called from upstairs, "Where's my briefcase? Anybody seen my briefcase?" Allison said, "Who's got a thief's face?" Darcy said, "Beef paste? What do you want that for?" Bard said, "Leaf race? I thought he said leaf race." They all laughed loudly and did not look for the briefcase. They could hear their mother and father banging doors and scuffling around upstairs, but they were so busy thought-you-setting they didn't even notice that Bard was standing in front of the briefcase, which was leaning against the radiator in the front hall. Finally, Mr. Burbank came running downstairs, wild-eyed and almost too late for his bus. He called to Mrs. Burbank, "If you find it, dear, bring it right down to the office. I must have it this morning." He slammed the front door and ran like the wind for his bus. Mrs. Burbank was giving the children their final inspection before school when she saw the briefcase leaning against the wall right behind Bard's little legs. She said, "Why, children, why didn't you tell Dad his briefcase was down here? You must have seen it. Now I'll have to make a special trip all the way down to take it to him. Why didn't you tell him?" She looked sternly at her three children. Allison said, "Briefcase? I didn't know that's what he wanted. I thought he said thief's face." Darcy said, "I didn't know he wanted his briefcase. I thought he said beef paste." Bard said, "I thought he said leaf race." Mrs. Burbank said, "You know perfectly well that Daddy wouldn't talk about a thief's face, beef paste, or leaf race. That's just nonsense, and I'm getting good and tired of all this thought-you-said business." She sent them off to school with a little push and without a kiss. But the thought-you-said-itis continued all the rest of that week. By Friday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Burbank were so irritable they didn't even want to come downstairs and eat breakfast with the thought-you-setters. They tried to solve the problem by not speaking to the children, but of course the telephone rang, and Mrs. Burbank said to Allison, "Answer the phone," and Allison didn't move, and her father said, "Answer the phone," and Allison said, "Oh, answer the phone. I thought you said, this ham's got a bone." And Darcy said, "I thought you said the dancers are home." And Bard said, "I thought you said, the jam's all alone." It was the last straw. Mr. Burbank said, "This nonsense has got to stop now. I am not going to eat another meal with the thought-you-saids." As soon as the children had left for school, and even before she washed the breakfast dishes, Mrs. Burbank decided that she must do something about the thought-you-setters. She poured herself another cup of coffee and sat down at the breakfast table and thought. Old Boy, the dog, came and sat beside her and she gave him a small piece of ham and stroked his head and wondered what to do. She was just going to call Mr. Burbank's mother when the telephone rang again. Mrs. Burbank answered it. It was Mrs. Piggle and she wanted the children to come for tea. Mrs. Burbank said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle, I am so delighted that you called. I was just sitting here at the breakfast table wondering what in the world to do." And so she told Mrs. Piggle about the thought-you-setters. Mrs. Piggle said, "There is a regular epidemic of thought-you-said-itis all over town. It really is a very harmless disease that can be most annoying to parents, especially when they are trying to hurry. I have suffered with it myself this past week. Put on your shoes is thought-you-said sat on a fuse. Get me a tack is thought-you-said butter a cracker, and on and on. Fortunately, the cure is very simple." And that's where we'll stop for today. So I want you to think about what the cure for these thought-you-setters could be and make sure that you are not suffering from thought-you-said-itis while you're at home with your parents. See you next time.